Welcome back to the podcast today and today's episode with me, Johnny Pardo. Today, I welcome Joe to the show where we're going to be talking about a real focus on mental health and particularly around first responders in that area as well. So, just a quick introduction to Joe, and then we'll dive into the conversation today. So, Joe is a decorated Marine Corps combat veteran and mental health advocate on a mission to transform crisis intervention and eradicate suicide among first responders. After serving in Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraq Freedom, Joe joined the San Antonio Police Department in 2005, co-founding its nationally recognized mental health unit. His innovative work in crisis response has had a lasting impact, influencing policing practices across the country and changing the way law enforcement approaches mental health. So, welcome to the show, Joe. I really appreciate all the work you're doing. Really important subject to my heart, mental health, and I can't speak on kind of like going into a first response job, but you know, like all the work you've been doing on that is incredible. So, yeah, I just would really interested to hear a little bit about what caused your transition from being this like Marine Corps veteran police officer to really going out there and speaking about mental health and training people about this?
Yeah, thank you, Johnny, and it's an honor for me to share your audience with you. And my story is one that is sadly similar to many that I'm sure you know and are listening to the show. But I grew up with a lot of childhood trauma, sexual abuse starting at 7 years old, followed by 8 years of physical abuse, and then essentially decided, that was enough for me. And I started staying with friends more and avoiding home as much as possible just because of the violence in my home. And because of that, my first child was born my senior year of high school, which was not part of the plan. And I love my daughter. She's 25 now, but that's the reason I joined the Marine Corps. It wasn't out of a desire for service. It wasn't, something I grew up knowing I wanted to do. I really had a passion for soccer, as we call it, or football, as you know it. And but when you have a child as a child, things change. And so I joined the Marine Corps, 2 combat tours. I get out. I'm 22. I don't have a college degree, and I'm not really sure what I'm going to do. So I joined the police department, and it was 5 years into my policing career where they were starting a mental health unit. And I had been through the training and it really did open my eyes. And so I joined the mental health unit, and it really was like one of those things that it truly saved my life. But something that I think is important is while I loved the work of mental health and I was telling people every day, all day, how they should help themselves and take their medicine and go to the doctor, I was a massive hypocrite. And I had not started helping myself at all. And I had years and years of trauma unprocessed from childhood,
Mm.
years of trauma from my combat deployments, and then even years of trauma as a young police officer of things that I had seen and dealt with and been a part of that I had never really processed. And it wasn't until I was going through my second divorce and just at rock bottom, one of many, I was acutely suicidal and just decided like I've got to, like, the common denominator in all this is me. And so I went to the hospital and started talking to a therapist, and I never stopped. And that's been now over 16 years. And I'm super engaged with my own treatment. But what I realized, and I'll stop here, is it was a fascinating thing that the more I was willing to show up and help myself, the better cop I became and the
Mm.
more able I was to help my community. And then I learned that the single greatest threat to the first responder profession is not the dangerous suspect out here, especially in the United States of America. There's so much perpetuation of this idea of safety and danger and violence. But the reality is that the greatest threat to a first responder is suicide. And
Mm.
so that became my realization and passion is I lost friends to suicide. And so I was like, there, to me, that's a choice. And while sometimes cerebrally I can understand why somebody might make that choice,
Mm.
for me it's it's never worth it. And I wrote a book earlier this year, and chapter 7 is called Worthy of Tomorrow. And it's just this idea that, we deserve to be here. It's a miracle that we were born, and taking your own life, no matter how dark or uncertain or scary it may be. If we can just weather that storm and get through that season, then there's beauty on the other side of it. Because I've been in dark places for much of my life, and I'm blessed to be in a place now where I find beauty in so many things.
That's amazing. That's amazing, Joe. And I appreciate your complete share there and
Yeah,
what you're doing and helping people and you describing you in quite a dark place or challenging place where you've been able to turn it around. Just going on the topic of suicide because I know it's obviously a very sensitive one and unfortunately, I mean I've looked at numbers and researched and like for me one is too many, but it's a lot more than
absolutely.
one. That's it's a lot more
Yeah.
than one and it happens in all genders. But for you, for those who have been like maybe they were thinking about suicide or were in that place, dark place, you said you were acutely at one point. Is there anything you've seen, like maybe a commonality or two that you've seen when they've turned things around, like how they've come out of that place?
Yeah, I think, and it's, first of all, anyone listening to this that happens to be in a dark place, you have to believe, one, you're not alone, but two, because anytime we're in these dark places where we think we don't want to be a burden on anyone else. So this
Mm,
idea of asking for help is so foreign that we're not willing to do it. As a speaker, Johnny, I go around giving keynotes, and the title of my talk is "We Need to Talk." And there's so many advocacy groups out there that talk about "I will listen" or we need to listen, but it's like, well, there's nothing to listen to if people aren't willing to speak up.
mm,
And especially when it comes to men, especially when it comes to first responders. We're so afraid of this idea of speaking out or asking for help
mm,
because it goes against the cultural norms, right? Of this idea of somehow you're weak if you ask for help. But to me, like that's the real strength and courage. And that so I want to be sensitive to the fact that the thing I'm about to share right now, listening to this, if you're of sound mind, lucid, and you're in a good place, it's like, well, yeah, that sounds ridiculous, but it really can be this simple sometimes, which is suspend time. Like what in my experience of doing this for over a decade and helping thousands and thousands of people that have been acutely suicidal, and then me myself, is we think that this whatever the crisis is that we're experiencing, we experience it as this massive grand thing that is impossible to hold and that it will never end. And so we think in terms of forever and always and never, I'll never get better, it's always going to be
mm,
bad, and we start to catastrophize. But the reality is it's a perspective shift. And if we could just zoom out, right? And I'm on the road 25 days a month, traveling, speaking, and teaching. And so for me, it's like anytime I'm on a plane and we get to that first bell when we hit 10,000 feet
mm,
of altitude, and you can now like take your tray table out and all those things, I look out the window and I just see towns. You see entire cities, entire towns, all these homes. And from that aerial perspective, it's like, it's just beautiful, it's peaceful, it's tranquil. But you know that inside every one of those homes is people with problems and fears and worries and uncertainties, and even people contemplating taking their life. And sometimes, if we can just zoom out to take a much more broad perspective, to realize that it's a miracle that we're here, no matter what we're going through. Now, again, if it's a terminal illness or something that's like incurable, but that's not the reason most people are killing themselves. Most people are killing themselves because of situational aspects of lives. Um, there's a myriad of reasons, but if we could just slow down, suspend time, and zoom out, like those are the two things that I think would
mm,
alter our perspective enough to realize that maybe I can hold on long enough. Maybe this will get better. It's not about going away, but maybe it'll get better. And you mentioned it on the onset when we were first talking, Johnny, which is about this idea that it is a journey, right? Like it's not going to get better today. It might not get better tomorrow or even next week, but it
Mm,
will get better if we're willing to just hold on long enough. Um, and then truly, my heart goes out to anyone listening to this that has lost families or friends
mm,
to suicide, or you yourself are in this fight. Again, I don't want it. I don't want to minimize it and make it sound like it's easy, because it
mm,
certainly is not.
mm.
And so much love to anyone that is struggling, but please reach out. Know that it is worth it. And if you don't get the response you're looking for from asking for help, it doesn't mean that asking for help didn't work. It just
Mm.
means that that person you reached out to didn't know how to hold that space for you.
Oh, I really love what you said at the end there with the reaching out, because I know for me when I've been in dark places, like when I've spoke to someone, that person sometimes can be actually quite a loving person, a good person, like, but they just don't necessarily have that capacity to hold emotions, and it's kind of,
Yep.
straight to their ideas, or it might because
Yeah.
they don't want to see you in pain. They're a loving person, or it could
They
just be,
inject their own bias.
yeah,
Yes.
they're going through their own stuff. Maybe it's not like, too bad, but they're dealing with their own stuff as well. So I love what you said there about finding that space. And I know when I've gone into men's group, and like that really was a transformation for me personally, because there were a bunch of guys who'd really worked on this, like, this healthy sense of who they were, and being able to sit with it, hold space for each other. And you could just, I remember my first coach, you're just so silent, just sit there. You're just like, oh, I felt so relaxed. Like I'm spreading my feminine energy. And it's just like, yeah,
Yeah. And even as you just did, like you took that big exhale, which for a
yeah,
lot of us, we haven't had that in years,
mm,
because we just carry so much stress and burden. And it's not that we want to, it's just we haven't learned or been supported in how to exhale and let go and realize that, like, it is going to be okay.
mm,
And when I gave a TEDx talk, and the saying is, it's okay not to be okay. It's just not okay to stay that way. And the reason we can,
mm,
or the way in which we can actually get better, is by having those supportive men groups. Good social relationships are one of the greatest cures to going through suffering alone, but the key is good, right? Is just as you mentioned, Johnny, is if you say something to someone or you open up to someone and they don't know how to hold that or what to do with that,
mm,
they might give terrible advice. But that shouldn't influence or sway you into thinking that asking for help doesn't work. It just
mm,
means that that person wasn't able to be what you wanted them to be in that moment.
mm. Holding that
But
space.
keep trying, because it's worth it for sure.
Yeah, no, I really wanted to touch on that point, because I know it can be quite, it can knock you back quite a bit if you share and you feel like you've not heard. So I think that's a
Right.
really important point there as well. For you, like you said about touching about like on, zooming out a little bit, and actually look at your perspective. Maybe you're not necessarily at that suicidal level, but maybe you're in quite a dark place. Maybe you're just like down. Is there anything like any kind of like self help tools that you find particularly useful for you to kind of just disengage with maybe some of these high flying emotions?
Yeah, great question. And for me, it's less about routines, right? There's so many gurus out there just saying, like, take a cold plunge and go in the sauna and life is better, eat your vegetables. And while that stuff we know is effective, that's not always the only answer for everybody, right? And for me, something that I learned in my own life that I think is very valuable is, as human beings, because we're habitual creatures, right? As Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about, he says our life is a series of automated habitual routines. So 95% of your life is just automation. It's the same thing tomorrow as it was yesterday, and it's just a continuation of the day before. It's like a carbon copy. And because this is true for so many people, it's easy to take so much of life for granted. It's just happening to us instead of us being an active participant in it.
Mm,
And a lot of us are kind of passengers in our own lives or victims in our own lives rather than taking ownership and control over it. So even a subtle thing, again, a word that we are all familiar with, and it's a buzzword now, especially in a post-COVID era. But when you think of like gratitude, anytime I hear someone say I had a bad day, and I'm like, is that really true though? Because I think every day has good and bad moments. To have a bad day is like something must be really significantly wrong,
mm,
because if you slept in a bed and you ate a meal and you're like gainfully employed and have money, did you really have a bad day or just you had a bad 40 minutes and now we're catastrophizing it to make it worse? And there's reasons why we do this, right? And so for me, it's like mindfulness and meditation and gratitude. When we can learn to, I'm a big believer in the Stoic principles, and I have a tattoo on my inner arm right here that says amor fati, which is the love of fate. And I have this belief that if it's happening to you, it's happening for you. And you can either learn the lesson or keep the pain. But for me, it's like there's a lesson in everything. And even something I tell when I'm doing my training, I tell them like as a challenge, I'm like, hey, when you brush your teeth tonight, use your non-dominant hand, because even that, like your brain is so used to just doing everything the same way. But when you can challenge it and say, I'm going to use my left hand, for example, because I'm right-handed, your brain is going to be super like lit up, ignited. Like, what is happening? Why are we doing this? Right. But it just gets those neurons firing. And then what if you were to use that opportunity to give yourself like two or three positive affirmations that you want to believe to be true about your life? And for years, mine were, you are worthy, you do deserve love, and you are lovable. Because those were things that I never believed in my life growing up. I believed I wasn't worthy. I had no self esteem, no self worth. And so I would self sabotage in my life and made my life very difficult. But I had to really convince myself that I am worthy of love. I do deserve to be loved, and I am lovable. And but if we can use our non-dominant hand, brushing our teeth, get our neurons fired up, give ourselves some affirmations, and then start a practice, informal or formal, of truly finding the good. And the framework I use is it has to be within the last 24 hours every single day, and they can never repeat. And it forces you to what I call minimize the sway, because anxiety is fear of a made up future. Your brain is telling a story about a future event. Depression, and I'm not minimizing the actual diagnoses of these, but depression is usually we're stuck holding something of the past.
Mm.
So, how can we minimize this sway? Because in our wake moments, our brain is future tripping, past dwelling, future tripping, past dwelling, stressed, depressed. And I think we can minimize that sway by grounding ourselves in the reality of what is happening right now in this moment. And can I possibly find something beautiful in it? There's birds outside chirping, watching the wind blow through the trees, and
Mm.
just like how beautiful it is as I look out my window. Something that simple that we normally would take for granted, but if I can choose to find beauty in it and real awe and wonder and appreciation of just nature, something like that simple can really shift our perspective and get the focus off of our pain and onto something that is much greater than we are our understanding.
Mm. I love that. And like someone opening the door, holding the door open for someone.
Yes,
I love that as an example because it's kind of that connection as well sometimes. So it's just,
right.
even if you
It's
don't
funny you
know a
say that.
complete
Yeah.
stranger.
Right. I use that example exactly when I'm like, gratitude practice daily is easy for the first couple days because it's like, I'm grateful for my job, I'm grateful for my house, I'm grateful for my family. But the fact that you can never repeat it. And I said, after about a week or two, it's going to get really hard and you have to really focus. And so, for example, I might be sitting there in the morning doing my gratitude practice and I'm like, oh, you know what? I'm grateful for the fact that like this man held the door for me at the gas station last night.
Mm.
Something, and I might have thanked the person, and I don't take it for granted. But the fact that now I'm recalling it to extend that moment of gratitude within the last 24 hours, because that's something that's just so simple. It's funny that you brought that up as your example, Johnny. I use that same one.
Like mine's like it. I
Yeah.
love what you're saying about the gratitude because I must admit I've been in that place where it's just like, oh, I'm grateful for like all these things I've created, or having a having a wonderful education, or not everyone gets that, and then it's kind of just saying the general things, and it's almost like
Right.
repeat. So I love that process. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't let it repeat, because I think again, we are so ingrained to focus on the things we do not have. Right? That it's the air of humanity is we're always pursuing wanting something else, something more, something different.
Mm.
And as long as we are wanting something else, something more, something different, it's going to lead to some voluntary suffering. And there's nothing wrong with wanting those things, but it's when that becomes the sole focus instead of focusing on what we do have instead of what we don't have, when we're in that lack space, it is voluntary suffering. And if we could just kind of refocus on what we do have and have genuine appreciation for it, again, I think it just creates different opportunities for our own mental health, it's a balance for sure. Because again, I'm all for pursuit of greatness, and like my morning reminder every day is you deserve greatness, and so let's not be lazy and just sit here and do nothing, but we have to go get it, right? So I'm all for the pursuit of greater things, but I also don't do that in exchange of not focusing on what I do have and what I am extremely grateful for.
Yeah. No, I love that. The greatness is a good power word as well. I've got a
Oh,
one of my mentors who's he sort of speaks with like Tony Robbins, but he's a quite a high performance specialist. But he
yeah,
had us do this exercise for kind of reminds me a little bit of what you're saying, but it was about self love and it or praising yourself because he's like, right, you achievers, you never praise. He's like, no one, you're always catching yourself out for the bad stuff. And you're not praising yourself. So it was like a gratitude for yourself, and it was 5 minutes each day for a week. You'd have to like write down as many things that you'd achieve, but you could not repeat. It
yeah.
was so he really made your brain thinking. But then after the week, it's just like, oh, I just did that. I'm amazing. So yeah, I
Yeah,
love.
yeah, and you look at that in reflection, you're like, wow, I'm kind of impressive,
Mm,
right? Which is something we have a hard time believing because um, even in doing things like this, Johnny, where you're in Europe, I'm in the United States, but if you were to just start this podcast and say, "All right, Joe, tell me the top 10 things that you're proud of achieving," immediately I would have locked up and been like, I have no like because we struggle so much with talking about the good things that we've done
mm,
because we associate that with being braggadocious or arrogant or
mm,
like, oh, that's a bad thing, and it's this idea too that of being selfish. And a lot of the work that I do, this is like in my branding, I got custom Nikes made and it says be selfish on the swoosh sign. I have t-shirts that say it because it's one of my personal mottos. But I want people to understand that when I talk about being selfish, because all of my work is on like how can we significantly reduce all the way to eradication of suicide. And and I think the reason why a lot of us get into this place is because somewhere along the way through our childhood into our young adult life is we develop this disease to people please. And as long as we're living in this vein of people pleasing, there's a really good chance we're going to let people down. And when we let people down, it's only because we haven't met some arbitrary expectation they set of us, right? Now, for me, when I say be selfish, it's not about at the expense of others, but it's about like what actually matters to me in my life because I matter in my life. And so, so many people in relationships, why they fail, because we give so much, we give so much, we give so much. And then it's doing is building up resentment. And then as soon as a need isn't met, then we have this implosion and it's like, this isn't fair. I do all this stuff for you that I don't want to do. That's the problem right there is you're just giving and giving
mm.
and giving and giving all while building up a
Yeah.
hope or an expectation for something in return. And it falls flat. So for me, it's like, how can I be selfish to prioritize what matters most to me? I have to stay involved with my therapy. I have to stay involved with my mindset stuff. I have to stay involved in my gratitude practice. I have to play golf because it's the thing that like centers me and it gives me some joy in my life. And as long as I'm doing the things that I love, now I can show up as the better version of myself for everyone else, for my wife, for my kids, for my employees, for my community. But I have to make sure I'm taking care of myself first. And not enough people do this because we think being selfish is a bad thing. I just want to invite all of your listeners to reframe that and realize selfish is the most important thing. And if you cannot take care of and love yourself, you're not going to be able to show up and do good for anyone else.
No, very true. I've certainly been guilty in the past as well, and I know other people like even I've coached. It's just you can have that build up, and then it's like, yeah,
Right.
because your needs aren't being met. Yeah,
Right.
so that totally makes sense. So yeah, being selfish in the good sense, it's not at the expense of others, like you said. It's
Right.
about it's kind of helping other people by looking after yourself in the best way. You know,
Absolutely.
being
Yeah.
an impact.
I go to therapy still 16 years later because I know the more I learn about myself, the more I'm going to be able to relate to and connect with other people.
That's awesome. No, good for you. Sort of still doing it. I found it really helpful as well. And
Yeah.
yeah, it kind of comes back. I've also found you have to might have to experiment with therapists. I don't know about you because sometimes again you may not link with. Maybe you found your first one first time, but yeah, I know I've spoken to other guests and it's like oh, I had to do a try a couple before I found someone I could talk to. So I just like to
Yeah.
emphasize that to the listener that again you got to feel comfortable in the space you're sharing.
It's a relationship, right? And I tell people the same of if you're listening to this and you're like, therapy's not for me, I've tried it. I just want to offer this that because I genuinely believe therapy is for everybody because you're alive living in a flesh suit and life is hard. There's challenges with work, profession, supervisors, friends, family. Like life is hard. And the great psychologist, Dr. Susan David, in fact, says the price of admission for a life well lived is suffering. And so if you tried therapy and you're like, it wasn't for me, maybe the truth is it's not that therapy wasn't for you, that therapist wasn't for you. I
Mm,
did get lucky. My first one was great, but my
mm,
third and fifth one were not. And 16 years in, I'm on and this is because either they retire, they promote, they move states, whatever the reasons are. I'm on my seventh one in 16 years. She's phenomenal. I've been with her now, like going on 7 years. Older, 75-year-old, white hair lady. She's great because she's what I need at this point of my life. If she was my first therapist, there's no world in which it would have worked out for me because I needed someone that was a little more
mm,
rough around the edges and harsh on me. Just because, I was working through my own childhood and daddy issues. And so I needed
mm.
that like rougher approach. Now I need to be coddled and told like, "Oh, you poor thing, I'm so sorry."
Okay.
But it's through seasons, right? And again, it is a relationship. And so you need to make sure that they do jive with you, connect with you, you feel safe with them, but see it as a relationship with safe boundaries.
Mm. I love that. Hey, that's awesome. 7 years as well. That's
Yeah, she's
a
great.
good
She's great.
relationship.
Yeah, but she's getting older. I tell her, I'm like, hey, I don't know what's going on with you, but I hope you have no plans on ever retiring or dying because if either of those happen, I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. So I need you to stay in there for life. And she's like, That's not going to happen. I'm going to retire eventually." I'm like, "Don't do it, Dr. D. Don't do it." Um,
I
but
love
yeah, we
that.
have a great relationship. So it's important, and I do worry about what happens when she retires just because I've been through so much with her and she has helped me immensely get to the place that I am right now. It's going to be very hard to replace her.
Thanks for sharing your experience with therapy and
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely been interesting when I've not been through as many, but yeah, just when I've tried it with different people. So no, that's cool. With the as first responders, like go through a lot of like situations, and I've known a couple in my time, and a few, are equivalent in the UK, like call different things names, but it can be quite hard from what I gather to switch off when you get home. But also we've got people have got all sorts of jobs where it's difficult to switch off when you get home, and you can never know what someone's going through in another job. But is there anything that you found when you're giving your talks or working with people in this capacity that helps them to sort of switch off? Because obviously in these highly stressful positions, it can be very, I'd imagine, fight or flight, kind of you're in that sympathetic nervous system, like go, 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 and very difficult to kind of calm down.
Right.
Is it like you found like therapy is the most useful thing for that, or just doing something like golf like you love doing, or does it kind of vary from person to person?
Uh, I think person to person would
Yeah.
say that it varies, but I also think that the reality of it is you brought up the sympathetic nervous system is, when we're in that fight or flight, there's
Mm,
also dopamine, which is incredibly addicting. And so we want to stay in this like heightened state because and the problem is it's masked in safety. But the flip side of that is you're also dumping massive amounts of cortisol, which is the stress
mm,
hormone, and which is I don't know how it is in the UK, Johnny, but um, in the United States of America, the average life expectancy is about 78 years old, but for first responders, it's 66.
okay.
So we're giving up 12 years off the top. And the reason I think we're giving up 12 years is because of cortisol. Just voluntarily dumping cortisol for 2 and 3 decades calling it safety. Yes, there's a time and place when we're on duty for sure. But again, then what do we do when we go off duty? This is a cultural issue that I think a lot of first responders are told the world is bad, people are dangerous, you're going to die. And so you're having to stay locked in all the time. I'm off duty at a restaurant, sitting with my family, but I've got to like watch the exits and make sure I'm scanning everything. And it's like, for what? Like, who's coming to get you? Um, but we want to feel safe because the brain craves that. The brain craves safety and familiarity. And so anytime something is unknown, we panic. And that's the life of a first responder.
Mm.
But the thing that I think we know works is um, simple things like box breathing, right?
Mm.
I would love if every first responder in between every call, or even if you're not a first responder, right? Like let's just say that you're working in a cubicle and you get a terrible email that like really frustrates you, and now you're emotionally dysregulated. You're
Yeah.
very angry.
Been there.
Just just do like a minute or 90 seconds of 4x4 box breathing,
Mm.
right? 4 second inhale, hold for 4 seconds, 4 second exhale, hold for 4 seconds, and just do that for a minute and a half. It absolutely will regulate your
Mm.
parasympathetic nervous system as well. The thing I heard about this that I loved is like babies, right? When babies cry and they're just wailing crying, right? What do you notice they do? They like cry, "Ah," and then they go, and they do that. So just even simple things like two big inhales in the nose, like this is from Dr. Andrew Huberman, who talks about that, like just two fast, powerful inhales in the nose and then one long exhale out of the mouth. You just do that 3 or 4 times. Again, you're regulating your system. And then the last thing I'll share on this is what we call the checkpoint, which let's say you work at a office or a substation or a fire station, wherever you work. Let's say home is 20 minutes away. So you find a physical landmark halfway between the two, and you just physically give yourself that transition time of, okay, I've got 10 minutes to think about work, process work, be angry about work, raw MF work, all the raw stuff you want. And then you get to that halfway point and it's like, okay, now what do I got to do when I get home? Do I got to stop at the grocery store? Am I making dinner? Am I doing homework with the kids? But it's about giving yourself that transition time and creating a physical like awareness that's like, all right, because the reality is the brain, there's no switch, right? It's not like, okay, I'm home now, I'm not going to think about work, or I'm at work now, I'm not going to think about, that's not how the brain is, right? Wherever you go, there you are. And so to say like just turn it off is kind of irresponsible. It's going to be there, but just be aware of it, right? I tell people, allow yourself to be where your shoes tell you you are. So don't wear your work boots when you're home, and don't wear your house shoes when you're on duty. So just look down at your feet, ground yourself, pay attention to where your shoes tell you you are. And if you're barefoot, there's a good chance you can relax.
Mm. That's awesome. I love what you said about the box breathing. That's
Yeah,
definitely a calm one, and that's what I trained in breath work as well as a facilitator. And
nice.
it's when you can kind of release that in a longer session, an hour can be really, really powerful. But just those
Sure.
short ones, day to day, can really, really
In between
help with that
calls.
nervous
Yeah.
system. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it takes a minute to like
Mm.
actually change and kind of just calibrate, because a lot of them will go from call to call to call to
Mm.
call, and they're just amped, 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 and then they marry each other because we want similar lifestyles, and so we end up marrying other first responders, and then we get home and it's like, let's just talk about work and what calls we had and how we don't like the supervisor and the sergeant, and so we're just staying amped up, and it keeps us in this heightened alert state, which doesn't allow us to really kind of have that exhale of, I am safe, everything is okay, I'm in my home, no one's coming to get me, I can let things go. But to me it really comes down to understanding awareness and choice. And once we, it's like the saying goes, once we know better, we do better. But we have to first understand that it is okay to turn all that off, and you don't have to be on guard all the time when you're with your family at an amusement park, at a park, at church. Just because bad things have happened once doesn't mean we need to live in a place where we think bad things are going to happen always.
Mm. No, powerful, yeah, powerful words, and trying to be like grounding yourself where you are as much as possible, and just bringing that awareness, that perspective, as you've been talking about as well, just zoning out a little bit. So, Joe,
Right.
I really appreciate everything you've shared today. I know you've got a ton more, and you're giving keynotes out and going on a lot of podcasts and sharing your message. So, again, really appreciate what you're doing out there.
Thank you, Johnny.
Just before we wrap up today, is there maybe a final point you want to leave us with, or maybe re-emphasize anything we've talked about today? And also, where can the listener find you to find out all about your work and your resources?
Yeah, thank you, Johnny. And again, thank you for your time and much love to you and your audience.
Thank you.
I can be found on joesmarro.com. It'll be linked in the show notes,
Yes.
but it's just my name.com. My company's website is solutionpointplus.com, all spelled out. And I'm on all the socials. I tell people in order of what I prefer, which is Instagram, LinkedIn, and then Facebook. And it's Joe Smarro at all of those. And the final high point I want to just tell people is if no one's told you today, I love you. And if you're wondering like, well, you don't even know me, why would you say that? That's not meaningful. I don't think we need to really know each other to love each other. The fact that we're all here, we're in this together. We are hoping together. We are dreaming together. We are also worrying together. We are afraid together. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world, but the reality is that your brain only sees what it looks for. And so let's take control of it. Let's manage it. Let's supervise it. Let's focus on the good things that are happening in the world, not just on what's missing and what's not going well, but let's focus on what is going well in both ourselves and also in each other. And so I love you, Johnny. I love your people of the UK and whoever's listening to this. And just remember that you are worthy, you are lovable, and you deserve to be here tomorrow. And so I wish you all the best with your show, and anyone that's going through anything, please, please, please reach out because you're not alone. Thank you.
Awesome. Love that, Joe. Thank you so much for all the great action points you've shared with us today. Very useful to implement as well. So thank you. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
So
Be well.
thank you. That concludes our episode for today. And remember to lead with your heart and not with fear.